The wrench slipped from Avery Knox's calloused fingers as another round of laughter echoed from the mess hall. She wiped her hands on her silver coveralls and adjusted her noise-canceling headphones, trying to block out the sound of pilots sharing their latest aerial adventures. At 38, she'd mastered the art of invisibility at Utah Air Force Base. Dose Tech strikes again, she heard someone whisper as she passed a group of young officers. The nickname had stuck for 3 years. Now, ever since she'd started appearing silently to fix problems and vanishing before anyone could properly thank her. They thought it was cute. They had no idea how right they were. Her official title was Basic Maintenance Engineer, specializing in radar systems, aircraft fuel loading, and HUD screen calibration. Tasks that kept her close to the machines but invisible to the people. She preferred it that way. Guilt was easier to carry in silence. The morning routine never changed. Arrive at 0500 hours sharp, check the overnight maintenance logs, and begin her rounds. The hangar bay was her sanctuary, filled with the familiar hum of diagnostic equipment and the metallic smell of aviation. Fuel. Here, among the F-15s and F-16s, she could almost forget who she used to be. Almost. Captain Marcus Webb swaggered into the hangar with his usual entourage of young pilots, their flight suits crisp and their egos inflated from another successful training run. At 26, Webb was everything the Air Force wanted in a poster boy: confident, charismatic, and completely unaware of his own limitations. "Hey, Ghost Tech," Webb called out, his voice carrying across the hangar. "Planning to fly planes. From memory? Maybe you should stick to oil changes and let the real pilots handle the flying." His buddies laughed on cue. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, barely out of flight school, added, "Yeah, we need someone who can actually handle G-forces, not just read about them in manuals." Avery looked up from the fuel gauge she was calibrating, her brown hair pulled back in. Its usual tight bun. She could see the humor in their eyes, the casual dismissal that came so easily to those who'd never faced real danger. She'd seen that same look in her own mirror once, years ago, when she thought she was invincible. "Just doing my job, Captain," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the hangar's ambient noise. Webb stepped closer, his confidence radiating like heat from a jet engine. "Your job is to keep our birds flying, not to pretend you understand what we do up there. There's a difference between reading flight manuals and actually pulling 7 Gs in a combat turn." The other pilots nodded in agreement. They'd all heard the stories about female pilots who couldn't handle the physical demands of fighter aircraft, who'd washed out of training programs or been relegated to transport duties. In their minds, Avery was just another mechanic who'd never had what it took to make it in the cockpit. Avery's hand stilled on the fuel gauge. For a moment, she considered telling them about the time she'd pulled 9 Gs in an inverted dive, while evading surface-to-air missiles over hostile territory. She thought about describing the sensation of afterburners igniting at 30,000 feet, or the split-second calculations required to line up a perfect gun run on an enemy fighter. Instead, she smiled softly, closed her technical manual, and walked away. No reaction, no argument. Just the quiet dignity of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone. But as she rounded the corner toward the next aircraft, her fingers unconsciously traced the small scar on her left temple, a reminder of the day her canopy had spiderwebbed from missile fragments, and she'd still managed to bring her wounded F-16 home. The young pilots didn't notice Chief Master Sergeant David Kowalski watching from the shadows near the tool crib. At 58, Kowalski had seen everything the Air Force had to offer, and something about the way Avery carried herself had always bothered him. Not bothered in a bad way, bothered like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit where everyone assumed it belonged. He'd been watching her for months, noting the way she moved around aircraft with the unconscious familiarity of someone who'd spent serious time in cockpits. Mechanics learned to respect the machines, but they didn't caress control surfaces like old lovers or check flight computer displays with the intensity of someone who trusted their life to those same systems. No, Kowalski said quietly to his assistant, Technical Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez. That woman knows more about flying than she lets on. Rodriguez glanced toward Avery, who was now performing a routine inspection on an F-15's engine intake. What makes you say that, Chief? Watch her hands, Kowalski replied. She's not just checking for foreign object damage. She's feeling for stress fractures in the metal that could affect flight performance. That's not maintenance thinking. That's pilot thinking. As if sensing their attention, Avery looked up and met Kowalski's eyes across the hangar. For just a moment, he saw something flicker in her expression, a depth of knowledge and experience that seemed impossible for someone with her official record. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar mask of professional competence. The rest of the day passed in routine maintenance tasks, but Kowalski couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Avery Knox than anyone realized. He'd seen enough classified personnel files to know that sometimes the most dangerous people were the ones who worked hardest to appear ordinary. That evening, as Avery packed up her tools and prepared to leave for her small apartment off base, she didn't notice Kowalski making a discreet phone call to someone in the personnel records office. She was too busy trying not to think about the photo hidden in her dresser drawer. 5 pilots in flight suits, arms crossed, standing in front of an F-16 with Viper Squadron painted on the nose. She was in the center of that photograph, the only woman, the youngest face wearing captain's bars. 4 of those pilots were dead now. She was the only survivor of Viper Squadron, and the only one who remembered what it felt like to be truly alive in the sky. But tomorrow would be another day of routine maintenance, another day of being invisible, another day of pretending that the most dangerous thing she'd ever done was calibrate a fuel gauge. The young pilots would continue their jokes, never knowing that the woman they called Ghost Tech had once been the most feared fighter pilot in the entire Air Force. Some secrets were worth keeping. Some legends were safer in the shadows. At least, that's what she told herself every night when she lay awake, listening to the sound of jets taking off in the distance and remembering what it felt like to soar. The anonymous email arrived in Colonel William Hayes' inbox at 0630 hours, marked Urgent Personnel Inquiry. The subject line read, Maintenance Technician Knox. Background verification required. Hayes frowned as he opened the message. It was professionally written but unsigned, requesting a comprehensive review of Avery Knox's service record. The sender claimed to have concerns about potential security clearance discrepancies and suggested that Knox might have access to classified systems beyond her authorization level. What bothered Hayes most wasn't the email itself. Anonymous tips weren't uncommon in military installations. What bothered him was the timing. 3 days earlier, he'd received a similar inquiry from base security, triggered by Kowalski's phone call to personnel records. Meanwhile, Avery was having the worst morning of her 8-year exile. The diagnostic computer for the F-15 squadron had crashed overnight, leaving her with no way to run the mandatory systems checks required before the day's training flights. Without those checks, the entire flight schedule would be delayed by at least 4 hours. Captain Webb appeared at her shoulder like a bad omen. What's the holdup, Ghost Tech? We've got a full training schedule today. Computer system failure. Avery replied, not looking up from the manual reboot sequence she was attempting. I'm working on it. Webb's voice carried the particular edge of a pilot whose schedule had been disrupted. Work faster. We've got congressional visitors coming next week, and Colonel Hayes wants everything running perfectly. Avery's fingers paused over the keyboard. She knew exactly what was wrong with the system, a corrupted driver file that would take the IT department 3 hours to identify and fix. She also knew a workaround that could have the system operational in 15 minutes, but it would require accessing administrative protocols that maintenance technicians weren't supposed to know existed. How long? Webb pressed. Standard protocol says I need to wait for IT support. Could be 3 to 4 hours. 3 to 4 hours? Webb's voice rose loud enough to attract attention from across the hangar. That's unacceptable. We have million-dollar aircraft sitting idle because you can't fix a computer? Lieutenant Morrison joined the conversation, his young face flushed with the indignation of someone who'd never missed a flight due to mechanical issues. This is exactly why women don't belong in critical positions. When the pressure's on, they can't handle it. The comment hung in the air like jet exhaust. Avery felt every eye in the hangar turn toward her, waiting to see how she'd respond to the blatant sexism. She could hear the whispered conversation starting, the subtle shift in atmosphere that happened when professional competence became a gender issue. I'm following standard safety protocols, she said evenly. Aircraft systems checks can't be rushed. Webb stepped closer, his voice dropping to a tone that somehow managed to be both private and public. Listen, Knox, I don't know what kind of maintenance experience you had before coming here, but this is a combat-ready installation. We don't have time for by-the-book procedures when there are workarounds available. There are no authorized workarounds for this system, Avery replied, which was technically true. The workaround she knew about wasn't in any manual. Then, maybe you're not the right person for this job, Morrison added. Maybe we need someone who can think outside the box when the situation demands it. Avery looked up from the computer screen, her brown eyes meeting Morrison's gaze with steady calm. You want me to compromise aircraft safety protocols to accommodate a training schedule? I want you to do whatever it takes to get our birds in the air, Webb said. That's what we pay you for. The conversation was attracting more attention now. Other pilots were gathering, along with maintenance crew and ground personnel. Avery realized she was being put on display, her competence questioned in front of everyone who mattered on the base. She could feel the weight of their expectations, the unspoken assumption that she would either perform a miracle or prove herself inadequate. It was a no-win situation carefully constructed by people who'd never had to make life or death decisions in the span of a heartbeat. I'll see what I can do, she said finally. Avery turned back to the computer, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. She accessed the system's diagnostic mode, bypassed the corrupted driver through a backdoor protocol, and manually initiated the aircraft interface sequence. The screen flickered twice, then displayed the familiar green status indicators. Systems online, she announced. You can begin your pre-flight checks. The hangar erupted in surprised murmurs. Webb stared at the screen, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion to something that might have been suspicion. How did you do that? He asked. Experience, Avery replied, already moving toward the next aircraft. But Chief Kowalski was watching from the shadows again, and this time he wasn't the only one taking notes. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez had filmed the entire exchange on her phone, supposedly for training purposes. The timestamp would show that Avery had accomplished in 12 minutes what should have taken the IT department 4 hours. As the pilots dispersed to begin their delayed training flights, Kowalski approached Avery with a maintenance request form. Need you to sign off on this inspection, he said casually. But when Avery looked at the form, she realized it wasn't a routine maintenance request. It was a security clearance verification, requesting confirmation of her technical certifications and system access levels. Chief, I'm not authorized to sign clearance verifications, she said. According to the system, You accessed administrative protocols this morning, Kowalski replied quietly. That requires level 2 security clearance. Your file says you're level 1. Avery felt the first real flutter of panic she'd experienced in 8 years. The system was malfunctioning. I used standard troubleshooting procedures. No, you didn't, Kowalski said, not unkindly. I've been fixing military computers for 20 years. What you did this morning was advanced systems administration. That's not maintenance work. That's the kind of knowledge that comes from specialized training. Their eyes met across the form, and Avery saw something that frightened her more than enemy missiles ever had: recognition. Kowalski knew she was hiding something, and he wasn't going to let it go. I learned some things in my previous assignment, she said carefully. Your previous assignment was aircraft maintenance at Nellis Air Force Base, Kowalski replied. I checked. They don't teach advanced computer systems there. Avery signed the form without another word, but her hand was shaking slightly. As she walked away, she could feel Kowalski's eyes following her, could sense the questions multiplying in his mind, like fault lines in metal under stress. That evening, she sat in her small apartment and stared at the hidden photograph for the first time in months. 5 pilots in flight suits, young and confident and completely unaware that 4 of them would be dead within a year. She'd thought she could hide forever. She'd thought her secret was safe in the classified files that only 3 people had ever read. But secrets had a way of revealing themselves when you least expected it, especially when you were too good at your job. The phone rang, startling her out of her reverie. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. Avery, this is Colonel Hayes. I need to see you in my office first thing tomorrow morning. We need to discuss your service record. The line went dead, leaving Avery alone with the growing certainty that her 8 years of hiding were about to come to an end. Colonel Hayes' office felt smaller than usual when Avery entered at 0800 hours sharp. The walls were lined with commendations, photographs of aircraft, and a massive American flag that seemed to dominate the space. Hayes sat behind his desk, a thick manila folder spread open before him. Sit down, Knox, he said without looking up. Avery remained standing. Sir, if this is about yesterday's computer issue, I followed all safety protocols. This isn't about the computer. Hayes finally looked up, his gray eyes sharp with the kind of scrutiny that made junior officers sweat. This is about your background check. The folder contained her official service record, but Avery could see additional documents clipped to the inside cover. Someone had been digging deeper than the standard personnel files. When you transferred to Utah Air Force Base 3 years ago, you listed your previous assignment as aircraft maintenance at Nellis, Hayes continued. But Nellis has no record of your advanced computer systems training. In fact, they have no record of you receiving any specialized technical education beyond basic mechanical maintenance. Avery kept her expression neutral. I've always been good with computers, sir. Self-taught, mostly. Self-taught. Hayes picked up a printed report from the folder. According to Technical Sergeant Rodriguez's documentation, you accessed Level 2 administrative protocols yesterday morning. That's not self-taught capability. That's specialized training that requires months of coursework as security clearance. The trap was closing with military precision. Avery realized that Rodriguez hadn't just been filming for training purposes. She'd been documenting evidence of security protocol violations. Sir, the system was malfunctioning. I used standard troubleshooting procedures. Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying her face. Knox, I've been in the Air Force for 22 years. I've seen every kind of cover-up, every kind of lie, and every kind of half-truth that people use to hide their mistakes. You're not lying to me. You're hiding something much bigger. Before Avery could respond, The office door opened. Chief Kowalski entered, carrying another folder that looked suspiciously official. "Colonel, you wanted to see this," Kowalski said, placing the folder on Hayes' desk. Hayes opened it and read for several long moments. His expression shifted from skepticism to confusion to something that might have been recognition. "Knox," he said slowly, "this is a classified personnel inquiry I submitted to the Pentagon yesterday. I asked them to verify your complete service history, including any records that might be above my clearance level." Avery felt her heart rate increase. "Sir, I don't understand." "The Pentagon's response is interesting," Hayes continued. "They confirm that you've been serving as a maintenance technician for 8 years. But they also note that your personnel file contains classified sections that require Level 4 security clearance to access." He looked up from the document. "I have Level 3 clearance, Knox. I can access every personnel file on this base except yours. The only files that require Level 4 clearance are for active combat pilots with special operations backgrounds." The silence in the office was deafening. Avery could hear her own heartbeat, could feel sweat beginning to form on her palms, despite the air conditioning. "Furthermore," Hayes continued, "the Pentagon's inquiry triggered an automatic security review. They're sending a team here next week to investigate potential security violations. If they find that you've been accessing systems above your clearance level, or if they discover that you've been concealing your true qualifications, you could face court-martial." Kowalski stepped forward. "Knox, I've been watching you for months. The way you move around aircraft, the way you understand flight systems, the way you knew exactly how to fix that computer yesterday. You're not just a maintenance technician." "I'm good at my job," Avery said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You're too good at your job," Hayes replied. "And that's what's going to get you in trouble." The colonel stood up and walked to the window overlooking the flight line. "You know what I think, Knox? I think you're former military intelligence, or special operations, or something else that explains why your file is classified. And I think you've been hiding it because you screwed up somewhere along the way." He turned back to face her. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me the truth right now, or I'm going to recommend that you be transferred to a non-sensitive position pending the security investigation. That means no access to aircraft, no access to classified systems, and no access to anything more sensitive than a wrench." Avery felt the walls closing in around her. 8 years of careful hiding, 8 years of maintaining the perfect cover. And it was all falling apart because she'd been too competent at fixing a computer. "I can't tell you what's in my classified file," she said finally. "But I can tell you that I've never compromised security, never shared classified information, and never done anything that would endanger this base or its personnel." "That's not good enough," Hayes replied. "The Pentagon team arrives in 5 days. If they find evidence of security violations, you'll be facing criminal charges. Your only chance is to come clean now and hope they show mercy." Kowalski pulled out a chair and sat down across from Avery. "Look, I've been in this business for 30 years. I've seen good people destroy their careers, trying to hide things that weren't even that serious. Whatever you're running from, it can't be worse than what you're facing now." Avery looked between the two men, seeing genuine concern in their expressions. They weren't trying to destroy her. They were trying to help her avoid destroying herself. But they didn't understand what she was really hiding, or why she'd been willing to spend 8 years in exile to keep it secret. "I need time to think," she said. "You have until 0800 tomorrow morning," Hayes replied. "After that, I file my report recommending your transfer to non-sensitive duties. Once that happens, the investigation becomes automatic, and there's nothing I can do to help you." As Avery walked back to the hangar, she felt the weight of every decision she'd made over the past 8 years. She'd thought she was protecting herself by hiding, But she'd actually been building a house of cards that was finally collapsing. The young pilots were already in the air for their morning training flights, their voices crackling over the radio as they practiced combat maneuvers. Captain Webb's voice came through the speakers, calling out altitude and heading changes with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced real danger. Avery stood in the middle of the hangar, surrounded by the aircraft she'd been maintaining for 3 years, and realized that her time as Ghost Tech was coming to an end. The only question was whether she'd go out quietly or finally reveal the truth that had been burning inside her for 8 years. That evening, she pulled out the hidden photograph and stared at the faces of her dead squad mates. Lieutenant Angela Rivera shot down over hostile territory. Captain Tom Bradley killed in a training accident. Major Steve Jackson died in a mid-air collision. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Wells lost to mechanical failure. 4 pilots dead, and she was the only one left to remember Viper Squadron. The only one left to carry the weight of what they'd accomplished and what they'd lost. She had less than 12 hours to decide whether to let that legacy die with her, or to risk everything by revealing who she really was. The decision, when it came, surprised her with its simplicity. She'd been hiding for 8 years, and she was tired of being afraid. It was time to stop running from the past and start fighting for the future. Avery didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, writing and crossing out different versions of the same impossible conversation. How do you tell your commanding officer that you're not who you claim to be? How do you explain 8 years of deception to people who trusted you? At 0500 hours, she made her decision. Instead of going to Hayes' office, she walked to the Secure Communications Center in the basement of the command building. The duty officer, Staff Sergeant Mike Thompson, looked surprised to see a maintenance technician in his normally restricted area. "I need to make a classified call," Avery said, presenting her ID card. Thompson checked her credentials against his access list. "Sorry, Knox. Maintenance personnel don't have authorization for secure communications." "Check again," Avery sighed quietly. "Look for any special annotations on my file." Thompson frowned but ran her ID through the system again. This time, his expression changed completely. "Holy shit," he whispered, then caught himself. Yes, ma'am. You're cleared for Level 4 communications. I'll set you up in Booth 3. Avery had memorized the number 8 years ago, never thinking she'd actually use it. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "General Patricia Morrison, Pentagon Special Operations." "Ma'am, this is Captain Avery Knox, Calcine Viper Hawk. I need to invoke Article 7 of the Special Operations Personnel Protection Protocol." The line was silent for nearly 10 seconds. "Captain Knox, your file indicates you've been inactive for 8 years. Are you currently under duress?" "Negative, ma'am, but my cover has been compromised. I need authorization to reveal my true service record to my commanding officer." Another pause. "Stand by." Avery waited, knowing that General Morrison was accessing files that existed in only one location in the entire Pentagon. Files that contained the truth about Viper Squadron, about the classified missions that had never been officially acknowledged, about the pilot who had voluntarily buried her own legend to escape the weight of survivor's guilt. "Captain Knox, you're authorized to reveal your service record to Colonel Hayes and up to 3 other personnel of your choosing. A complete file packet will be delivered to Colonel Hayes within 2 hours. Is there anything else you need?" "Just one thing, ma'am. How much trouble am I in?" General Morrison's voice softened slightly. "Avery, you've been carrying a load that would have broken most people. The fact that you're still serving, still protecting your country, tells me everything I need to know about your character. You're not in trouble. You're coming home." At 0800 hours, Avery knocked on Colonel Hayes' office door. He was already seated behind his desk, the same manila folder open in front of him. "Knox, I hope you're here to tell me the truth." "Yes, sir." "But first, you're going to receive a classified delivery from the Pentagon. I recommend you read it before we continue this conversation." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "You contacted the Pentagon?" "I contacted someone who's been waiting 8 years for me to make that call." As if. On cue, there was a sharp knock on the door. A courier in military dress uniform entered, carrying a sealed envelope marked with classification stamps that made Hayes' eyes widen. "Colonel Hayes, I have a delivery requiring your personal signature and immediate review." Hayes signed for. The envelope checked the classification level and looked at Avery with new respect. "This is level 4 classified." "How did you read it, sir? Then we'll talk." Hayes opened the envelope and began reading. Avery watched his expression change, from confusion to amazement to something approaching awe. The document was comprehensive. Mission reports, kill confirmations, commendations, and a complete record of the classified operations that had made Viper Squadron legendary in certain circles. "Jesus Christ," Hayes whispered. "You're Captain Avery Knox, Viper Hawk. 17 combat missions, 2 confirmed kills, 0 losses until..." He looked up. "Lieutenant Angela Rivara was your wingman. She died covering your retreat." "Yes, sir." Hayes continued reading. "After her death, you voluntarily requested transfer to non-combat duties and had your entire service record classified. You've been hiding in plain sight for 8 years." "Yes, sir." "Knox, Captain Knox, do you have any idea what this means? You're one of the most accomplished combat pilots in Air Force history. We have young pilots here who study your missions in flight school, and they don't even know you're real." Avery remained standing at attention. "Sir, I've been serving to the best of my ability in my assigned position. I've never compromised security or endangered personnel." Hayes set down the document and studied her face. "The question is, what do we do now?" "The Pentagon investigation team is still coming next week. But instead of investigating security violations, they're going to find one of the most decorated pilots in the Air Force working as a maintenance technician." "That's my choice to make, sir." "Is it?" Hayes walked to the window again. "Knox, we're facing a pilot shortage. Congressional funding is being cut. We need experienced combat pilots more than ever, and I've got a living legend fixing fuel gauges." Before Avery could respond, the door burst open. Chief Kowalski entered without knocking, his face pale with excitement. "Colonel, we've got a problem. Alpha Squadron is 20 minutes overdue from their training mission. Last radio contact was them reporting engine trouble over the mountain training area." Hayes grabbed his radio. "Control tower, what's the status?" "On Alpha Squadron?" The radio crackled with static. "Sir, we lost contact 18 minutes ago. Their transponders went dark simultaneously. We're showing no radar contact. Send up search and rescue." "Sir, Bravo Squadron is deployed in Afghanistan. Charlie Squadron is in maintenance rotation. Delta Squadron won't be mission ready for 4 hours. We don't have any pilots available for immediate deployment." The control room fell silent. Avery could hear the desperation in the radio operator's voice, could feel the weight of 2 missing pilots somewhere in the vast mountain wilderness. Hayes looked at her with sudden realization. "Knox, you're the only combat qualified pilot on this base right now." "Sir, I haven't flown in 8 years. I'm not current on procedures, not cleared for combat operations." "You're cleared for whatever I say you're cleared for," Hayes interrupted. "And according to this file, you've got more combat experience than every other pilot on this base combined." Kowalski stepped forward. "Captain, there are 2 pilots out there who might be alive. They need help now, not in 4 hours." Avery felt the familiar weight of command decision settling on her shoulders. It was the same feeling she'd had 18 times before. The moment when everything else faded away except the mission and the people who needed her. "Sir, I'll need access to an F-15 strike." "Eagle, I'll need someone to verify that the aircraft is combat ready." "Done," Hayes said. "Kowalski, get Captain Knox whatever she needs." As they rushed toward the hangar, Avery felt something she hadn't experienced in 8 years. The electric anticipation of getting back in the cockpit where she belonged. The Ghost Tech was about to become Viperhawk again, and this time, she wasn't going to hide from who she really was. The sky was calling, and she was finally ready to answer. The F-15 Strike Eagle sat in the hangar like a sleeping predator, its twin engines gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Avery approached the aircraft with the careful reverence of someone returning to a sacred place after a long exile. "She's fully fueled and weapons ready," Chief Kowalski reported, running through the pre-flight checklist. "All systems show green. But Captain, this bird's been configured for air-to-air combat. If Alpha Squadron went down in the mountains, you might need ground attack capabilities." Avery was already climbing into the cockpit, her hands moving over the controls with muscle memory that 8 years of hiding couldn't erase. "Chief, if our pilots are down in hostile territory, I'll need whatever weapons you can load. Maverick missiles, cluster bombs, and full cannon ammunition." "Hostile territory?" Kowalski looked confused. "Sir, they were on a routine training mission over the Utah wilderness." Colonel Hayes' voice crackled through the hangar's communication system. "All personnel, this is a classified briefing. Alpha Squadron was not on a training mission. They were conducting a reconnaissance flight along the Canadian border, investigating reports of illegal weapons trafficking. The area they were patrolling has been linked to a militarized smuggling operation." The hangar fell silent. Suddenly, the missing pilots weren't just dealing with mechanical failure. They were potentially facing armed hostiles in a combat situation. "Control tower, this is Viperhawk," Avery said, her voice steady and professional. "I'm requesting immediate clearance for combat operations." The radio operator's voice was shaky with disbelief. "Viperhawk, confirm your identity. That call sign has been inactive for 8 years. "Control tower, this is Captain Avery Knox, call sign Viperhawk. I'm the pilot who's going to bring our people home." Hayes took the microphone. "All stations, this is Colonel Hayes. Captain Knox is cleared for immediate combat operations. Viperhawk is back on active duty." Avery sealed her helmet and began the engine startup sequence. The twin turbofans roared to life with a sound that sent vibrations through her entire body. For the first time in 8 years, she felt complete. "Viperhawk, you're cleared for takeoff. Godspeed." The F-15 screamed down the runway, afterburners blazing. Avery pulled back on the stick and climbed at a 70-degree angle, reaching 15,000 feet in less than 2 minutes. The mountain landscape spread out below her like a 3-dimensional map, and she began calculating flight paths and search patterns with the tactical precision that had made her legendary. A radio crackled with intercepted communications. American aircraft confirmed down. Pilots ejected. Beginning ground search in Sector 7. The voices had Russian accents mixed with local dialect. Avery's blood ran cold. Alpha Squadron hadn't just crashed. They'd been shot down by the same weapon smugglers they'd been investigating. "Control, this is Viperhawk. I'm picking up hostile communications. Our pilots are alive, but in immediate danger." "Viperhawk, what's your assessment?" Avery banked hard around a mountain peak and spotted smoke rising from a narrow canyon. "I've got visual on the crash site. I count 6 hostile vehicles converging on the area. Request permission to engage." "Viperhawk, you are cleared to engage. Bring our people home." Avery felt the familiar calm that settled over her in combat situations. The noise, the confusion, The fear, all of it, faded away until there was only the mission and the perfect clarity of purpose. She rolled inverted and dove at an 80-degree angle, building speed until her aircraft was screaming through the air like a guided missile. The hostile convoy was bunched together in the canyon with no room to maneuver, a tactical error that would cost them everything. At 2,000 feet, she squeezed the trigger. The M61 Vulcan cannon fired 100 rounds in 2 seconds, 20mm shells tearing through the lead vehicle's engine block. The truck exploded in a ball of orange flame, the blast echoing through the canyon like thunder. Control. This is Viperhawk. First target destroyed. Beginning second attack run. Avery pulled out of her dive and climbed for altitude. A radio crackled with panicked enemy voices. We're under attack. American fighter aircraft. Request immediate air support. No air support available. Take cover. She lined up on the mobile SAM launcher, the greatest threat to her aircraft. Approaching from a different angle, using the sun's glare to mask her approach, she released 2 GM-65 Maverick missiles from 3,000 feet. Both missiles found their target. The SAM launcher disappeared in a massive explosion that shook the canyon walls. Viperhawk to any American personnel in the area. If you can hear this transmission, signal your position. A weak voice responded. Viperhawk, this is Alpha 2. We're alive but injured. Alpha Leader has a broken leg. We're hiding in the rocks about 500 meters east of the burning vehicles. Copy that, Alpha 2. Stay hidden. I'm calling extraction now. Avery established a combat air patrol pattern over the area, scanning for additional threats while coordinating with the rescue team. Her hands moved over the controls with the unconscious precision of someone who had never really stopped being a combat pilot. Control, this is Viperhawk. I have visual confirmation on both Alpha Squadron survivors. They're alive but need immediate medical evacuation. I'm maintaining air cover until rescue arrives. 20 minutes later, a rescue helicopter appeared. On the horizon, Avery watched through her targeting system as the crew chief rappelled down to extract the injured pilots. Both men were alive, conscious, and waving as they were lifted to safety. Control, this is Viperhawk. Both pilots are secure. Mission accomplished. When her F-15 touched down at Utah Air Force Base, half the personnel on duty were waiting on the tarmac. Word had spread quickly. Ghost Tech was actually a combat legend who had just saved 2 lives and completed a mission that should have required an entire squadron. As she taxied to her parking spot and shut down the engines, Avery felt her legs shaking slightly from adrenaline, but her face remained calm, professional, controlled. She popped the canopy and climbed down from the cockpit to find Colonel Hayes approaching with a crowd of officers behind him. Captain Knox, that was some of the finest flying I've ever witnessed. We owe you a debt we can never repay. Just doing my job, sir. Like hell you were. You saved 2 lives and neutralized a hostile force that could have threatened our northern border for months. He paused, studying her face. I'm recommending you for immediate reinstatement to active combat duty. The Air Force needs pilots like you. Avery looked toward the hangar where her maintenance tools were waiting. With respect, sir, I'd prefer to return to maintenance. Hayes stared at her in disbelief. Knox, you can't be serious. You're one of the best combat pilots this country has ever produced. Why would you want to stay in the shadows? She thought about Lieutenant Angela Rivera, about the weight of survivor's guilt, about 8 years of carrying the memories of 4 dead squadmates. Then she looked at the crowd of young pilots, watching her with new respect and understanding. Because, sir, sometimes the best way to serve is to be ready when nobody expects it. Captain Webb pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been shame. Captain Knox, ma'am, I owe you an apology. I had no idea who you were. You still don't, Avery replied calmly. I'm the same person I was yesterday. I just had a different day at work. Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward, his young face serious. Ma'am, would you be willing to teach us? About flying. I mean, real flying? Avery studied his face. He was young, eager, and completely unprepared for what real combat flying demanded. Just like she had been at his age. Just like Angela Rivera had been. Show up at 0500 tomorrow. We'll start with systems checks and basic aerodynamics. If you can handle that for a month without complaining, maybe we'll talk about advanced maneuvers. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Chief Kowalski appeared at her shoulder, a knowing smile on his weathered face. Captain, I always knew there was more. To you that met the eye. What gave it away, Chief? The way you touched the aircraft. Mechanics respect the machines, but pilots trust them with their lives. There's a difference. As the crowd began to disperse, Hayes pulled Avery aside. Knox, I understand why you want to keep a low profile. But what you did today, that's going to be classified at the highest levels. The weapons smuggling operation, the hostile contact, all of it. Officially, you conducted a successful search and rescue mission during a training accident. I appreciate that, sir. But unofficially, word is going to spread. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. Every pilot on this base now knows that Ghost Tech is actually Viper Hawk. Avery nodded. She'd known this moment would come eventually. The question was whether she was ready to live with the consequences of being visible again. That evening, she found a package outside her quarters. Inside was a worn flight helmet, the exact type she had used in Viper Squadron, with her original call sign painted on the side, Viper Hawk. A handwritten note was attached. We owe you, and we're still learning from you, even when you never need to say a word. The sky is lucky to have you back. Avery held the helmet but didn't put it on. Some symbols were more powerful when they remained retired, waiting for the moments when they were truly needed. The next morning, she arrived at the hangar at 0500 hours to find Morrison and 3 other young pilots waiting for her. They stood at attention, their faces serious and respectful. Good morning, Captain, Morrison said. We're ready to learn. Avery looked at their eager faces and saw herself 8 years ago confident, capable, and completely unaware of how much they didn't know about the realities of combat flying. First lesson, she said quietly. Flying isn't about being the best pilot in the sky. It's about bringing everyone home. If you can't handle that responsibility, you have no business in a cockpit. As she began their education in real combat flying, Avery realized that her 8 years of hiding hadn't been a waste. They had been preparation for this moment, when she could finally use her experience to prevent other young pilots from making the same mistakes that had cost Angela Rivera her life. The legend of Viper Hawk had returned, but this time, she wasn't fighting alone. 3 days after the rescue mission, 2 unmarked black sedans pulled up to the main gate of Utah Air Force Base. The visitors wore civilian clothes, but moved with the precise bearing of career military officers. Their credentials identified them as Pentagon Special Operations Review Board, the same people who had spent 8 years respecting Avery's request for anonymity. Colonel Hayes met them in his office. The classified file about Avery's mission spread across his desk. The lead investigator, a stern woman in her 50s, introduced herself as Director Janet Phillips. Colonel Hayes, we're here to conduct a comprehensive review of the incident involving Captain Knox. What she accomplished was remarkable, but it's also raised some concerns at the highest levels. Hayes leaned back in his chair. What kind of concerns? The kind that happen when one of our most classified pilots suddenly resurfaces and engages hostile forces without proper authorization, Phillips replied. Captain Knox has been inactive for 8 years. She underwent no recent training, no qualification updates, no psychological evaluation. Yet she single-handedly neutralized a heavily armed smuggling operation. The second investigator, a younger man named Agent Mark Reynolds, pulled out a tablet. Our preliminary investigation shows that Captain Knox accessed classified systems, initiated combat operations without proper chain of command authorization, and engaged foreign hostile forces in what could technically be considered an act of war. Hayes felt his temper rising. She saved 2 American pilots who were under fire from enemy forces. What exactly are you questioning? We're questioning whether someone with her psychological profile should have access to combat aircraft, Phillips said. Captain Knox requested transfer to non-combat duties after experiencing severe trauma. She's been hiding her identity for 8 years. That suggests significant psychological issues that could affect her judgment in combat situations. Her judgment seemed pretty solid when she was pulling our people out of a hot zone, Hayes replied. Reynolds consulted his tablet. Colonel, Captain Knox violated at least 12 different protocols during her mission. She engaged hostile forces without positive identification. She operated outside her assigned area of responsibility, and she used lethal force without going through proper escalation procedures. She did what was necessary to complete the mission. That's exactly the problem, Phillips said. Captain Knox operates outside normal command structures. She makes her own rules, follows her own protocols. That makes her extremely dangerous, regardless of her intentions. Hayes stood up and walked to his window overlooking the flight line. Director Phillips, are you here to investigate Captain Knox, or are you here to recruit her? The question hung in the air for several moments. Phillips and Reynolds exchanged glances, some kind of silent communication passing between them. Both, Phillips finally admitted. The Pentagon is facing a crisis, Colonel. We're losing experienced combat pilots faster than we can train new ones. Budget cuts are forcing us to reduce pilot training programs just when international tensions are increasing. We need people like Captain Knox. But we also need people who can follow orders, Reynolds added. Captain Knox has demonstrated that she's willing to ignore chain of command when she thinks the situation requires it. That's problematic for military discipline. Hayes turned back to face them. What exactly are you proposing? Phillips opened a briefcase and pulled out another classified folder. We want to offer Captain Knox a position with the Pentagon Special Operations Aviation Unit. It's a small, elite group of pilots who handle classified missions that require exceptional skill and discretion. Essentially, we want her to do officially what she's been doing unofficially, Reynolds explained. Operating outside normal command structures, taking on missions that other pilots can't handle, maintaining a low profile while delivering exceptional results. Hayes studied the folder. And if she refuses? Then she returns to maintenance duties, and we pretend this conversation never happened, Phillips said. But Colonel, we both know that's not a sustainable solution. Captain Knox is too skilled to waste on fuel gauges, and after what happened this week, she's too visible to maintain her cover. Before Hayes could respond, there was a knock on his office door. Chief Kowalski entered, his expression grim. Colonel, we've got a problem. Captain Knox didn't report for duty this morning. Her apartment manager says she packed up and left some time during the night. No forwarding address, no contact information. Phillips and Reynolds looked at each other with alarm. She ran? Reynolds asked. Looks that way, Kowalski confirmed. Left a note saying she was taking emergency leave and would be in touch when she was ready. Hayes felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. Any idea where she might have gone? Her personnel file lists next of kin as her aunt in Montana, but we called and she hasn't heard from Captain Knox in months. Phillips stood up abruptly. Gentlemen, we have a serious security issue. Captain Knox has access to classified information about current operations, And she's just disappeared without authorization. This is now a matter of national security. Reynolds was already on his phone, calling in resources. I'm initiating a federal search. We'll have her located within 24 hours. But Hayes was thinking about his conversation with Avery, about the way she'd looked when she talked about preferring to serve in the shadows. He had a feeling that if Viper Hawk didn't want to be found, she wouldn't be. Meanwhile, 300 miles away, Avery was sitting in a small diner in Wyoming, reading news reports about the training accident that had resulted in 2 pilots being rescued. The official story made no mention of hostile forces, weapons, smuggling, or combat operations. It was exactly the kind of careful cover-up that she'd expected. Her phone buzzed with another call from an unknown number. She'd been getting them all morning, probably Pentagon investigators trying to track her down. She turned off the phone and paid for her coffee. The truth was, she hadn't run because she was afraid of the Pentagon's offer. She'd run because she was afraid she might accept it. The feeling of being back in the cockpit, of using her skills to save lives, of finally being who she really was, it had been intoxicating. But she'd learned 8 years ago that being Viper Hawk came with a price. People followed her into danger, trusted her judgment, depended on her skills. And sometimes, despite her best efforts, they died. She wasn't sure she was ready to carry that weight again. But as she drove through the Wyoming wilderness, she couldn't shake the memory of Morrison and the other young pilots waiting for her at 0500 hours, eager to learn from someone who understood the realities of combat flying. Maybe running away wasn't the answer. Maybe it was time to stop hiding from who she was and start using her experience to make sure the next generation was better prepared than she had been. The phone rang again. This time, she answered it. Captain Knox, this is General Patricia. Morrison, we need to talk. General Morrison's voice was calm but firm. Captain Knox, you have 24 hours to report to Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs. After that, your disappearance becomes a federal fugitive matter. Avery pulled over at a rest stop, the weight of 8 years of running finally catching up with her. General, with respect, I never asked to be dragged back into this world. No, but the world needs you in it, Morrison replied. Avery, I've been protecting your secret for 8 years because I believed you needed time to heal. But what happened at Utah Air Force Base proves that you're ready to serve again. Ma'am, I saved 2 pilots. That doesn't mean I'm ready to be responsible for an entire squadron again. It means you're exactly who we need for the job I'm offering. Morrison's voice softened slightly. Avery, I'm not asking you to lead combat missions. I'm asking you to train the next generation of pilots so they don't make the same mistakes that cost Angela Rivera her life. The mention of Angela's name hit Avery like a physical blow. General, that's not fair. Fairness has nothing to do with it. Angela died because your squadron wasn't properly prepared for the situation you encountered. You spent 8 years carrying that guilt, but instead of letting it destroy you, you can use it to save other pilots. Avery stared at the Wyoming landscape, thinking about Morrison and the other young pilots who had been waiting for her. At 0500 hours, they were eager, confident, and completely unprepared for the realities of combat flying. Just like she had been, just like Angela had been. What exactly are you offering, ma'am? Command of the Combat Aviation Training Institute at Peterson. You'll work directly with pilot candidates who show exceptional promise but need advanced tactical training. Your job will be to turn good pilots into great pilots and great pilots into survivors. Avery closed her eyes. And if I refuse? Then you go back to hiding, and I find someone else to train pilots who will inevitably face situations they're not prepared for. How many Angela Riveras are you willing to accept to maintain your anonymity? The question hung in the air like smoke from a missile strike. Avery realized that Morrison was right. she'd been selfish in her grief, hiding her knowledge and experience while other pilots faced the same dangers that had killed her squadmates. "I'll be there in 18 hours, she said finally. Peterson Air Force Base was a sprawling complex of runways, hangars, and training facilities nestled against the Colorado Rockies. When Avery arrived, she was met by a young lieutenant who looked barely old enough to drive, let alone fly military aircraft. "Captain Knox, I'm Lieutenant Sarah Martinez. General Morrison is waiting for you in the briefing room." As they walked through the facility, Avery noticed the intensity of the training operations. Pilots were conducting simulated combat exercises, practicing formation flying, and running through emergency procedures with the kind of focus that suggested they knew their lives would depend on getting it right. General Morrison was standing in front of a large tactical display when Avery entered the briefing room. She was older than Avery had expected, with gray hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of making life-and-death decisions. "Captain Knox, thank you for coming." "General Morrison, I'm here, but I want to understand exactly what you're asking me to do." Morrison gestured to the tactical display, which showed a map of global hotspots where American aircraft were currently deployed. "We're facing the most challenging operational environment in decades. Advanced surface-to-air missiles, sophisticated electronic warfare, enemy pilots with training that rivals our own. The tactics that worked 10 years ago will get our pilots killed today." She pressed a button, and the display changed to show casualty statistics. "We're losing experienced pilots faster than we can replace them. The pilots we're sending into combat are technically proficient, but they lack the tactical instincts that come from real-world experience." "That's where you come in," Morrison continued. "Your combat record is unparalleled. 17 missions, 0 losses until the final engagement. You understand how to survive in situations where other pilots fail." Avery studied the statistics. "General, I've been out of the cockpit for 8 years. The technology has changed. The threats have evolved. The fundamentals haven't changed," Morrison interrupted. "Good pilots live, bad pilots die. And the difference is usually measured in split-second decisions based on experience and instinct. That's what you bring to the table." Morrison pulled out a chair and sat down across from Avery. "I'm not asking you to fly combat missions. I'm asking you to teach other pilots how to survive them. Take everything you learned in Viper Squadron, every mistake, every success, every hard-won piece of knowledge, and pass it on to the next generation. What about the Pentagon investigators? They seem to think I was a security risk." Morrison smiled grimly. "Directors Phillips and Reynolds work for me. Their job was to evaluate whether you were psychologically stable enough to handle this assignment. Disappearing for 3 days wasn't ideal, but it proved that you're still capable of evading detection when necessary. That's actually a valuable skill for this position." Avery felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. This was all planned, wasn't it? The investigation, the job offer, even my rescue mission at Utah. "The rescue mission was real, and you saved 2 lives, Morrison replied. "But yes, we've been looking for the right opportunity to bring you back. The Air Force needs what you have to offer, and frankly, I think you need this as much as we do." Morrison stood up and walked to the window overlooking the flight line. "Avery, you've been hiding from your past for 8 years. But your past is what makes you valuable. Angela Rivera died, but the lessons you learned from her death can save dozens of other pilots. What if I fail? What if the pilots I train make the same mistakes anyway? Then you'll have done everything you could to prepare them. That's all any of us can do." Morrison turned back to face her. "The alternative is to let them learn through trial and error, and we both know how that usually ends." Avery thought about Captain Webb and Lieutenant Morrison, about their casual confidence and complete ignorance of the dangers they would eventually face. She thought about Angela Rivera, dying alone in a burning cockpit while covering Avery's retreat. She thought about 8 years of maintenance work, 8 years of hiding her knowledge while other pilots made preventable mistakes. General, I have one condition. Name it. I want complete autonomy over training methods and curriculum. No interference from Pentagon bureaucrats who think they understand combat flying but have never been shot at. Morrison smiled. Done. You'll report directly to me, and I'll handle any political complications that arise. Avery stood up and extended her hand. When do I start? Tomorrow. Your first class consists of 12 pilots who've been selected for advanced tactical training. They're all technically proficient, but they need someone to teach them how to think like combat pilots. As they shook hands, Morrison added, Avery, welcome back to the war. That evening, Avery sat in her new quarters and opened the file containing profiles of her first students. 12 young pilots, all eager to prove themselves, all confident in their abilities, all completely unaware of how much they didn't know. She thought about Angela Rivera, about the price of inadequate preparation, about the responsibility of turning these young aviators into survivors. For the first time in 8 years, Avery Knox felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The legend of Viper Hawk was about to begin a new chapter, and this time, her mission was to make sure that other pilots' stories didn't end the way Angela's had. 6 months later, Avery stood in the same briefing room where General Morrison had convinced her to return to active duty. But this time, she wasn't alone. 12 pilots in flight suits sat at attention, their faces bearing the kind of focused intensity that came from training under someone who had actually survived everything they were learning to face. Lieutenant Morrison, no relation to the general, raised his hand. Captain Knox, permission to speak? Granted. Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for what you taught us about situational awareness. Last week, during the red flag exercise, I detected an incoming SAM that the computer systems missed. The techniques you showed us about reading terrain and anticipating threats probably saved my life. Avery nodded, feeling a familiar mixture of pride and responsibility. That's exactly why we train, Lieutenant. Real combat isn't about following checklists. It's about recognizing danger before it becomes lethal. Captain Jessica Chun, one of the few women in the program, spoke up. Captain, what you said about trusting your instincts even when the instruments disagree, that resonated with me. In civilian flying, we're taught to trust the gauges over our feelings. But in combat, sometimes your gut knows things that sensors can't detect. Your instruments can lie, malfunction, or be compromised by enemy jamming, Avery replied. Your instincts are harder to fool if you train them properly. She walked to the tactical display and brought up a mission scenario. Today's exercise is based on a real engagement from 2017. Viper Squadron was tasked with intercepting a high-value target convoy moving through mountainous terrain. Intelligence suggested light resistance, minimal anti-aircraft capability. The pilots leaned forward, recognizing this as one of Avery's actual combat missions. She rarely shared details from her service record, but when she did, it was always to illustrate a crucial lesson. What actually happened was a sophisticated ambush. The enemy had positioned mobile SAM units in concealed locations, used electronic jamming to degrade our communications, and set up the convoy as bait to draw us into a kill zone. She pressed a button, and the display showed the tactical situation as it had actually unfolded. My wingman, Lieutenant Rivera, detected the trap before I did. She called for an immediate abort and began evasive maneuvers. I should have listened to her. The briefing room was completely silent. Everyone knew this was the mission that had cost Rivera her life and ended Avery's combat career. Instead, I pressed the attack. I thought I knew better. I thought my experience and training made me invulnerable. Avery's voice remained steady, but the weight of 8 years of guilt was evident. Rivera died covering my retreat. She died because I was too arrogant to listen to good advice from someone with less experience. Lieutenant Morrison spoke carefully. Ma'am, from what we've studied, your decision was tactically sound based on the intelligence available at the time. That's exactly the kind of thinking that gets pilots killed, Avery replied sharply. Tactics change. Intelligence is often wrong, and the enemy gets a vote in how every engagement unfolds. The moment you think you have everything figured out is the moment you become vulnerable. She turned back to the display. The lesson here isn't about specific tactics or procedures. It's about humility. No matter how experienced you become, no matter how many successful missions you complete, you're always one mistake away from disaster. Captain Chun raised her hand. Captain, how do you balance confidence with humility? We need to believe in ourselves to be effective in combat. Good question. Confidence comes from training, preparation, and experience. Humility comes from understanding that the enemy is also trained, prepared, and experienced. Your job is to be better than they are, not to assume that you automatically are. The training session continued for another hour, covering advanced tactics, threat recognition, and emergency procedures. But the real lesson was deeper than technical knowledge. It was about the mindset required to survive in combat aviation. After the pilots were dismissed, General Morrison entered the briefing room. How are they progressing? Better than I expected, Avery replied. Morrison shows real promise. He's got good instincts, and he's not afraid to ask questions. Chun is technically excellent and thinks strategically. The whole group is starting to gel as a unit. Any concerns? Avery considered the question. They're all still a little too eager to prove themselves. That's natural at their experience level. But it's also dangerous. Combat aviation isn't about heroics. It's about completing the mission and bringing everyone home. Morrison pulled out a folder marked with classification stamps. Speaking of missions, we've got a request from CENTCOM. They want to borrow some of our advanced tactical training graduates for a special operation in the Middle East. Avery felt her stomach tighten. These pilots aren't ready for real combat operations. They need at least 6 more months of training. I agree, but the operational commanders are pressuring us to accelerate the program. They need experienced pilots now, not next year. General, with respect, that's exactly the kind of pressure that led to Rivera's death. Rushing pilots into combat before they're ready is a recipe for casualties. Morrison closed the folder. I told CENTCOM the same thing. Our pilots graduate when you say they're ready, not when some staff officer decides he needs warm bodies in cockpits. Avery felt a wave of relief. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet. There's something else. Morrison walked to the window. The Pentagon is creating a new elite aviation unit, the Tactical Combat Squadron. They want you to command it. Ma'am, I'm happy where I am. Training pilots is important work. It is, but this would be training and leading the best pilots in the Air Force. Hand-picked volunteers. Unlimited resources, missions that other units can't handle. Morrison turned back to face her. It's a chance to build the kind of squadron that could have prevented what happened to Rivera. Avery thought about her current students, about the responsibility of command, about the weight of other people's lives hanging on her decisions. I need time to consider it. Take all the time you need. But Avery, you've spent 8 years hiding from leadership. Maybe it's time to embrace it. That evening, Avery walked out to the flight line and stood beneath the wing of an F-22 Raptor. The aircraft was beautiful and deadly, representing the pinnacle of American aviation technology. In the right hands, it was nearly invincible. In the wrong hands, it was just another expensive way to get pilots killed. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Lieutenant Morrison. Captain, Thank you for everything you've taught us. Whatever you decide about the new command, know that you've already made a difference. Rivara would be proud." Avery smiled, feeling something she hadn't experienced since before Rivara's death: peace with her past and hope for the future. She'd spent 8 years carrying the guilt of one pilot's death. Maybe it was time to focus on preventing future deaths instead of dwelling on past failures. She pulled out her phone and typed a message to General Morrison. "Ma'am, I accept the command position. When do we start?" The response came back immediately. "Welcome to the Tactical Combat Squadron. Colonel Knox, your promotion papers are already in process." Colonel Knox, after 8 years of hiding behind maintenance coveralls and false modesty, Avery was ready to embrace who she really was: one of the finest combat pilots in American history, and perhaps more importantly, one of the best teachers the Air Force had ever produced. The legend of Viper Hawk was entering its final chapter, but this time, the story wouldn't end with tragedy. This time, it would end with dozens of young pilots who were better prepared, better trained, and better equipped to survive the dangers of modern combat aviation. Rivera's death had taught Avery about the price of failure. Now it was time to teach others about the value of excellence. As she walked back toward the base headquarters, Avery thought about the photo she'd kept hidden for 8 years. 5 pilots standing confidently in front of their aircraft, unaware of the dangers ahead. Soon she'd have dozens of new photos, showing pilots who understood those dangers and were prepared to face them. The ghost was finally ready to stop haunting the shadows and step back into the light. Some legends hide in plain sight, waiting for the moment when the world needs them most. For 8 years, Avery Knox had been that hidden legend. Now, as Colonel Knox, she was ready to create new Legends pilots who would carry on the tradition of excellence that had made Viper Squadron famous, but with the wisdom to avoid the mistakes that had made them martyrs. The sky was vast, dangerous, and unforgiving, but it belonged to those who respected its power while refusing to surrender their wings. Colonel Avery Knox was ready to fly again, and this time she wouldn't be flying alone. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.